I want to begin this morning by reading an account of Gideon's battle against the Midianites from the book of Judges. But I'm not going to read it from any of the standard Bible translations, but from a work called The Book of God by Walter Wangerin. The Book of God is a novelization of the Bible, or at least the central story of the Bible, which is the developing relationship between God and the children of Abraham, eventually between God and all of humanity. The Book of God isn't a translation and it isn't complete, so there's no way in which it is a substitute for the Bible. But to be honest, the real Bible can be difficult to read. It requires constant and active use of the imagination, and truly understanding the Bible stories often requires some knowledge of the geography and the social structures that pervaded the Near East 3,000 to 2,000 years ago. The Bible is written from within a time and place so alien to our own place and time that it can be nearly impossible sometimes to know how to put ourselves into the story. Not everything in the Bible is hidden from us by history and culture. The poetry, the prophecy, and many of the laws are accessible to us even if we lack the proper context for them. And as friends, of course, we trust that the Spirit teaches us what we need from the words of the Bible at the time that we need them. But still, some of the history, some of the stories just doesn't resonate. With the best of intentions, our imagination is sometimes not well enough informed to help us understand the significance of what we're reading. And that's how it is with the story of Gideon and the Midianites. Myself, I really didn't understand what was going on in that story until I read it in the Book of God. So, based on the 7th chapter of Judges, this is the story of that battle as Walter Wangerin imagines it in the Book of God. In darkness, Gideon issued each of his men a ram's horn, a hollow jar, and a torch. While they were yet close before him, he whispered their orders. "Whatever I do, you do likewise," he said. "When I blow my horn, blow yours exactly where you stand. Shatter your jars and light your torches and shout, 'A sword for the Lord and Gideon.'" Gideon divided the 300 men into 3 companies and sent them north and west and south of the valley until they became a thin, invisible loop in the hills surrounding Midian. In the tents of the Midianites, 135,000 warriors slept in the assurance of their great numbers. Watchfires burned at intervals throughout the wide installation, 10,000 of those. Camels were gathered in great herds, the easier to feed, 5,000 corrals, 100,000 head. And men stood watch around the entire perimeter, gazing out into the darkness, expecting nothing. Then, just as guards went forth to start the middle watch, a single horn wailed in the hills west of the camp, a snarling, irascible sound as if it were a wild beast upon its prey. The watchmen of Midian turned. "Who prowls the darkness blowing a ram's horn?" But other horns joined their voices to the first, as if the sound were a fire. It raced left and right around the hills, violent, loud, predatory. "Who fights in the night?" Naked Midianites started to step out of their tents. "Who hazards a perfect darkness? What madness is this?" Suddenly, from all the hills around the camp, great crashings and shatterings came down. "What? What?" cried Midian, seizing swords and spears. "What army is charging down the slopes at us?" Now torches were exposed on high, a ring of flame encircling Midian, and human throats were bellowing, "A sword for the Lord and Gideon." And all the warriors of the Midianites were awake now, crying, "They've cut us off. Even their rear guard is swarming down the hills. Fight, fight, fight." But those whom Midian slaughtered were their brothers. Terrified by the night attack, sightless, fearing infiltration, they slew whomever came near. They killed each other. Gideon bellowed on the hillside and then watched Midian destroy itself until there were no more than 15,000 left. Remember that we started with 135,000 Midianites, and those who wind up fleeing back to Karkor, their own city, are now only 15,000. The thing is, and the reason I think this story speaks to us in this particular time, this particular American political season, I might say, is because, especially the way Walter Wangerin imagines it, Gideon's battle with the Midianites is ultimately a story about the difference between fear and faith. What I mean is the experience of the Midianites turning on each other in the dark, striking down their comrades and brothers on the evidence of their own fear. That story helps me understand a biblical passage which is way better known than the story of Gideon, but is always, I think, a challenge. I mean these verses from the first epistle of John, the 4th chapter. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. We love because God first loved us. Those who say, I love God, and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. The commandment we have from God is this: those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also. What challenges me in these verses is that their promise of perfect love casting out fear seems impossible for me to live into. I read these sentences and I tend to imagine myself walking down some dark and mostly but not completely deserted alley at night somewhere, and I have yet to experience in myself the kind of love that would take away my fear in that situation. My fear of the unknown, my fear of the stranger. So it's all well and good that perfect love casts out fear, but not much help to me when all I can seem to muster is my imperfect love and my built-in apprehension of the unfamiliar. But the story of the Midianites against Gideon reminds me that our enemies aren't the only beings that we fear. Broken and fallible as we are, we often fear our neighbors as well, not only our neighbors, but our family, our brothers and sisters, and even our friends. We fear them for any number of reasons. We fear them because they've said or done something to wound us, and the better they know us, the more power they have to wound quickly and deeply. We fear them because they are new neighbors. Not only do we miss the old neighbors, the arrival of the new neighbors means the neighborhood will change. We've really liked the pale yellow house next door, and we notice the new neighbors are painting it dark blue. We can't argue that the house really needed to be painted, but why did they have to change the color? Even worse, it looks like they're going to cut that big old maple to get more sun in their backyard and to keep their roof from rotting. But we've always loved the shade that maple gives to our yard. So we fear the changes that neighbors can bring. And we may even fear our neighbors, if only because it's dark outside, because we can't see where we're going, because we're afraid, and because our neighbors are close at hand and easy to strike. But the problem with fearing our neighbors, even beyond the fact that God asks us not to, the problem with fearing our neighbors this way is that we wound ourselves and our own hopes when we mistrust those whom we love or those with whom we covenant. Take the neighborhood in which any of us live. As Wayne reminded us, none of us are going to live forever. Is it better that each time a neighbor moves away, or for that matter, dies, struck down by an old person in a parking lot? Is it better that their house remains empty? Then everything around us can stay exactly the same, a little shabbier, maybe a little worn out, but everything can stay the same, just with fewer people, fewer cookouts, less fun, less intimate conversation, until gradually there are no cookouts and no conversations, and the yards are all overgrown, and you realize that you have no neighbors at all, but at least your neighborhood has never changed. That's one option. The other way to protect yourself from change is to regulate it. Pass laws and covenantal restrictions that define exactly how you're supposed to behave in the neighborhood. Then you wouldn't have to be afraid of your neighbors. As long as you could find people who want to come to a place where they have to plant exclusively Kentucky bluegrass and cut it exactly 1 inch high, plant only daisies and sunflowers and borders along fences, agree to never build an above ground swimming pool. Once again, you either wind up with an empty neighborhood because of restrictive demands, or more and more people come in who refuse to agree to the covenant, and you're back to the same old problem. How do you love your neighbors, new and old, so different from you, who keep bringing change to your front door and your backyard? I think it turns out that living in a neighborhood or belonging to a community is every bit as dangerous as breathing, because you can really get sick from breathing. You can fall prey to bacteria and viruses, or inhale and circulate pollution through your blood. Breathing is a really risky business. The only thing riskier probably is not breathing at all. If I don't breathe, I die. It's the same way with neighbors. We find a way to live with the difference in the change that each neighbor brings to the neighborhood, or the neighborhood dies. I can think of only one answer to this problem, and it's the very answer set forth in the story of Gideon and in the first epistle of John. The antidote to our fear can only be faith. Faith in God's creative and transforming power, faith in God's ability to make great what seems to be small, faith that what others intend for evil, God can reshape into good. The theologian Rowan Williams points to this kind of faith as one of Christianity's most basic premises. Williams writes that the principle upon which every other aspect of faith relies is that God is trustworthy. God can be trusted. God is trustworthy because God has no selfish intention. God is trustworthy because God doesn't need anything from creation. And because God doesn't need anything from creation, God is free to love purely and without reservation. What God does shows us what God is. And one way of saying what God is, Williams writes, is this: at the heart of the desperate suffering there is in the world, suffering we can do nothing to resolve or remove for good, there is an indestructible energy making for love. If we have grasped what Jesus is about, we can trust that this is what lies at the foundation of everything. Williams goes on to connect the personal experience that many of us have of God's forgiving, unconditional love with God's ongoing creative power. What we say about God as maker of everything, and what we say about God who meets us personally in forgiveness and renewal, ought to be as closely allied as possible, he writes. The Bible seems again and again to hold creation and salvation inseparably together. This seems to be a far piece from Gideon, but I don't think it really is. What it meant for Gideon what it meant for the author of 1 John, what it means for us is that we don't have to believe that any of our neighbors are trustworthy in order to trust them. We have only to believe that God intends good to come from our interactions with them. Let me emphasize that. What it means for us to believe that God is trustworthy is that we don't have to believe in the trustworthiness of any of our neighbors in order to be without fear in our interactions with them. We only have to believe that God, who is trustworthy, intends for good to come from our interactions with our neighbors. I absolutely cannot say that I have reached that level of assurance myself. I don't think I'm at the place yet where I can walk into any interaction with my neighbor or my enemy without fear, because I know that God will find a way to bring good from it, despite my enemy's intentions or my neighbors. But sometimes I do get a glimpse of what that would look like. And I get those glimpses because of a few experiences I have had of true Quaker process when we make decisions together. A few decisions that I have been part of here and in other meetings, where each one of us let go of our idea of what needed to happen, let go of our need to protect the way we think things ought to be, gave up trying to control the process, laid down our fear of confusion, and agreed to wait together because we had to admit we didn't know. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know what was best. We didn't know who God was calling us to be. And in that confusion, we waited and God showed up. Not just to one or two of us, regardless of the others, but to everyone. That, I think, is how I can understand the perfect love that casts out fear. It's what happens when I allow myself to trust my neighbor, not because my neighbor is trustworthy, but because God is trustworthy. And I have decided to be willing to wait upon God.